Hunting the Boojum. The heroic misadventure of the Wizard of New Zealand, QSN.
I'm flying around in a place that I found. You can't see the sky, there's nothing around but yellow, blue, green and gold flying.
Ah, but a man's reach should exceed his grasp, or what's a heaven for? On each December the 4th, during the years 1970 to 1973, residents in the charming Victorian precinct of Parkville, adjoining Melbourne University, might have seen a few students led by a bearded figure in a gown proceeding towards the nearby Burke and Wills monument. This had been erected to commemorate the starting point of the preposterous and hugely hyped expedition by Burke and Wills, which set out to cross Australia from south to north about 100 years earlier. This was the site I chose to mark each year's progress before I set out on my own preposterous expedition to cross the universe from south to north to mark the 42nd year since my birth. The highlight of the ceremony each year was the reading of Lewis Carroll's masterpiece, The Hunting of the Snark. I had reached the halfway point in my life 3 years earlier, and like Dante, I found myself in a dark wood, faced with a fork in the path. I too chose the rough track, and as in Dante's case, what followed was a series of extraordinary attacks on my psychological, social and cultural well-being. I have taken both epic poems as my guide ever since. A spasmodic career concealing a master plan. I had decided from a very young age to live my life out in 7-year cycles. I preferred approaching the meaning of my life analogically rather than digitally. Just adding the years was too mechanical. On reaching the age of 35, I assumed I would have accumulated enough experience by reading promiscuously, backpacking in the USA, Europe and the Middle East, and living in England, Canada, Iran and Australia, to have absorbed enough to cease being a voyeur and could come out like a debutante and join in the games of intellectual and political one-upmanship. In 1967, to the surprise of those who knew me at this point in my life, I gave up a flourishing career as the university's Commissar of Cultural Events in Western Australia, to move to the University of New South Wales in Sydney to become the first qualified academic lecturer in Australia in the mushrooming new field of sociology. I was not quite sure where my new action role would take me, but whatever it was, it must culminate when I entered the final of the 7-year cycles. The Youth Revolution.
Rainbow Man, color your days as only you can. Rainbow Man.
During the middle and late 1960s, events around the world had taken a sudden surprising turn, and teenagers in general, and university students in particular, were behaving in ways that resembled medieval revitalisation movements. These remarkable cultural phenomena could alter reality for large numbers of people. I was teaching in this very topic at the time, together with researching for a PhD thesis in creative expression and cultural values. This was my chance to come out of the trenches. Realising that cultural phenomenon usually reached antipodes a year or so later than Europe and North America, I prepared to surf the tsunami of hysterical self-confidence that was approaching our shores. I based my approach on a synthesis of logic, love and levity, and took the unusual step of founding a reform movement that I called Action for Love and Freedom, or ALF, and anchored it securely on the university as a community of scholars. The Fun Revolution. My academic training in psychology and sociology helped me to analyse what was happening and to keep a cool head. My sunny disposition, which followed a happy, non-dogmatic Christian childhood, had even survived compulsory secular education due to frequent changes of school following evacuation in wartime England. I was more attracted by hippie sentiments of love and conservatism of the environment than by Marxist hatred of the system, etc., of the rising student power movement. Levity, or playfulness, is, I believe, a characteristic of Anglo-Saxon culture in particular, though the Czechs seem very similar. Raised on a diet of Itmar and the Goon Show on the radio, and with the love of Chaucer, Rabelais, Cervantes, Chapek's Good Soldier Schweik, and with respectable theoretical underpinning from Huizinga's book Homo Ludens, I started the fun revolution. Logic and love were in the wings, but levity was centre stage. This is not the place to give even a brief account of what happened during the fun revolution at the University of New South Wales between 1967 and 1969. Suffice to say that it included my being dismissed from my teaching fellowship without consultation or appeal by my humorless Marxist head of department. He had been recruited from the ranks of political science, and like many politically motivated intellectuals, was probably baffled by my sociological and psychological sophistication. Subsequently, however, I was rescued by being appointed as official university wizard by the Vice-Chancellor and student administrations. This liminal role gave me many opportunities to revitalise the campus. The World University Service. Towards the end of 1969, with the backing of the university and student administrations, I travelled to Hamburg and obtained the support of the headquarters of the World University Service, or WUS, for a proposal to travel round the campuses raising fun and funds for the WUS branches and giving oratorical performances on various radical, sociological and psychological topics not generally promoted. Only France and Italy were opposed. WUS is a voluntary, non-aligned, mutual aid organisation of students, administrators and academics, and was therefore ideal backing for my revitalisation campaign.
Cry for me.
The day the music died.
Please say you won't cry for me.
Suddenly, the colourful youth movements everywhere turned into cauldrons of hysterical hatred. Love, logic and levity evaporated almost overnight. Between 1969 and 1970, at Melbourne University and all over the country, fun-hating, corrupt and violent fundamentalist student politicians seized power, fixed meetings and censored all the student newspapers. I started a joke and the whole world started crying. Within a few months I'd become the Antichrist. My opponents bore an uncanny resemblance to Oliver Cromwell's Puritan saints. In 1970, without warning, and a few weeks into my World University Service tour, and without any active campus branches knowing what was happening, the headquarters of WUS in Australia was taken over by extremists to be used as a political front organisation. The office in Melbourne did not respond to my letters and appeared to have vanished. The user communications with the active WUS branches ceased. It turned out to be another stupid Maoist libertarian coup. I began to think I was becoming a very dangerous radical who must be stopped by fair means or foul. WUS was not a very wise choice for a socialist takeover, since it was a voluntary, independent organisation, and there were no compulsory fees to exploit as a source of income. WUS in Australia soon collapsed, and has never recovered. But my career and personal life have been wrecked again. At the age of 38, penniless, homeless and jobless, I was now marooned in Melbourne. But as a hardened backpacker of many years, I was able to cope. I decided to persist with my campus revitalisation activities, so I became associated with the University Union Activities Office, which was fortunately not run by the new student para-elite. I became the official wizard and shaman of Melbourne University Union. I was also their official cosmologer and living work of art. I was covering all the important aspects of the wizard's role set.
The universe is love and it surrounds you.
Creating my own universe. Since coming out of the trenches, my life had been destroyed twice by blind fear and irrational hatred. It became obvious that I needed a more accurate cognitive map to avoid being shipwrecked again. As Union cosmologer, I gave lectures and held open discussion groups on the synthesis of recent scientific ideas in all fields. This was in the tradition of the sociology of knowledge and the social construction of reality. The Vice-Chancellor allowed me the use of a temporarily unused Gothic building on campus for this purpose. This was known as the Department of Levity. Thus was born my aesthetic process cosmology, which I first published and circulated in 1972. Like the philosopher A.N. Whitehead, though without consciously realising the similarity, I had scrapped both belief in the autonomous, independent existence of what we believe to be objective reality, or Aristotelian substance-based science, and the belief that reality is little more than a psychological, socio-cultural product, Platonic idealism, socialism, and postmodern French deconstruction notwithstanding. Scientific dogma confounded. Relativity theory was born following the death of God, who had previously provided the absolute frame. Then the discovery of whole families of subatomic particles and quantum theory in general had put paid to the search for the solid atoms as the building blocks of the universe. Since the time of the ancient Greeks, natural philosophers had devoutly believed that these atoms determined ultimate reality. Now the fundamental basis of the laws of nature was confounded. Earlier, having ridiculed divine causation, they had simply replaced it either with belief in the immortality of sacred matter, like Einstein, or with a naive belief in continuous creation. Now, the fundamental base of the laws of nature was confounded. Earlier, having ridiculed divine causation, they had simply replaced it either with belief in the immortality of sacred matter, like Einstein, or with a naive belief in continuous creation. What they found was the Big Bang, a singularity which happened outside time and space for no reason at all, and requires belief that a tiny, zero-dimensional point contained enough energy to create an entire expanding universe. Believing in divine causation, creator gods, and trusting established religion is like swallowing a fly. Believing in chance causation and materialistic reductionism and trusting established science is like swallowing a horse. As Burl Ives put it in the folk song about the old lady, she died, of course. The madman with the lantern. Of course, priests at the time had been deaf to the fearful cries of Nietzsche's madman running through the streets with a lantern, crying out, "God is dead!" Now, 100 years later, the madman is running through the streets with an even more fearful cry, "Nature is dead! Nature is dead!" As expected in their secure and respected jobs, government and business-employed academics and scientists are deaf to his new cries. But more and more independent thinkers are realising the mind-blowing implications of relativity theory in all fields and the end of the insane belief that scientific observers are immaterial spirits who can stand outside the universe to measure it. The hunting of the quark. I began to realise that my deep responsiveness to the hunting of the snark was due to the way the narrative paralleled events in the world of materialistic science. The reductionist scientists, who had been assiduously hunting the irreducible atom, had stood erect and sublime for a moment of time, when they thought they had finally found the ultimate building blocks of matter that made up and controlled the universe. Then they discovered the atom was not solid. It was made up of even smaller atoms, like quarks, and so ad infinitum. And these did not behave like building blocks at all. They and their hopes were confounded, sucked down into the horror vacui of the uncaused first cause, the Big Bang. In the words of Lewis Carroll, that concludes his poem, yet with the first words that came into his head in 1874, for the snark was a Boojum, you see. Alice. Like Lewis Carroll, I flourish on telling preposterous, imaginative stories to intelligent women. Their response has inspired me to attempt impossible feats of intellectual daring. It is my substitute for conventional economic, moral, sexual or political display. Unlike Carroll, who appears to have suffered from arrested sexual development, I was capable of combining both intellectual and sexual attraction and satisfaction. Until 1970, my previous attempts to come across an Alice had failed. At the critical times when my career and home base were destroyed, I was abandoned and betrayed by those I had trusted most. More a case of malice in Blunderland. At this time in 1970, when I was casting around for a fresh start, I was introduced by the Anglican chaplain at Melbourne University, another echo of Lewis Carroll, to a romantic young Catholic classics undergraduate named Alison. After very carefully studying me and my mother, who was on a visit at the time, she finally made her move. Alison became Alice, my spellbound love slave. She stood beside me as the storms of frenzied and irrational hatred of the student power elite broke over me again and again as I tried to continue my fun revolution. Without her, they would probably have succeeded in their desperate need to drive me off the campus. Instead, against immense organised opposition at noisy mass meetings, the University Union finally published my collection of short, provocative articles entitled The Wizard's Nonsense Almanac of 1974. Now I can set off on my great adventure. Falling through the earth. An imagination experiment. I was now even further radicalised. What did I have to lose except my sense of humour, my warm self-regard, and my acute recognition of bullshit when I sent it? In other words, my logic, love, and levity. Like the bellman in the epic poem, I started by ditching the conventional signs of both moral and scientific dogma, and became empowered by the sheer delight that also informs Carroll's imaginative writing. Haunted by the strange, multi-level synchronicity of the magic number 42, I began to direct my course towards Antipodes Island with the intention of conducting an imagination experiment on my 42nd birthday. My plan, as the official shaman of Melbourne University Union, was to attempt to fall through the earth, like Alice in Wonderland. Ignoring friction, etc., scientific calculations, provided in Martin Gardner's annotated Alice, indicate it would take 21 minutes to reach the centre, and then another 21 to reach the opposite pole, a total of 42 minutes. The same number, 42, occurred as having immense but incomprehensible significance in the BBC radio science fiction series Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Written a few years later, the most imaginative BBC drama since the Goon Show vignette. On my 42nd birthday, on December the 4th, 1974, I would also enter the 7th stage of my final set of 7-year cycles. 1974 is not only divisible by 42, but is also the 100th anniversary of the writing of The Hunting of the Snark. The inspiration for the poem came to Carol at the age of 42, in a series of visions. How could I resist? My motto was now reductio ad absurdum, turning the universe inside out. According to relativity theory, in the absence of any absolute frame, the Earth could be turned upside down by a conformal inversion of the old-fashioned God-given coordinates, but would appear to an uninformed eye to be unchanged. This had been common knowledge even before Einstein. What was not known by most educated people, including astrophysicists, was that the Earth could be turned inside out the same way. The Earth was no longer a tiny sphere surrounded by the immense universe, but an immense spherical hole enclosing what appears to be a tiny universe. Again, it would appear to the uninformed eye to be unchanged. The only question is, which is to be mastered? Conventional ideas of size depend not only on simple deceptive appearances, but on the totalitarian power of the ruling elite of reality controllers to determine both the location of observers and the model they have decided that everyone must adopt. Scientists have always been the willing servants of the evil lords of the military-industrial complex, so the model of the Earth they have imposed on us through compulsory secular education is the one that makes terrestrial navigation and ballistic calculations the only important concern. Occam's razor gang were called in to cut any non-utilitarian alternatives to pieces. That was the fate of poor Mustafa Abdul-Qadar's speculative model. Logic, love and levity are always overruled by the utilitarian needs of the welfare warfare state capitalists or socialists.
The color of infinity,
Universal levitational force. During the planning stages in my Department of Levity at the University of Melbourne between 1971 and 1974, I was proceeding in the manner described by Lewis Carroll, who, as Charles Dodson, was not only a cleric in the Anglican Church at Christchurch College, Oxford, after which our city is named, but he was also a well-respected mathematician. Years later in Christchurch, like the bellman who as a captain regularly confused the bowsprit and rudder of his ship, I became famous later for owning and displaying my Volkswagen Beetle, where it's impossible to tell which end is the front. More importantly, like the bellman, I had completely rejected not only conventional motivation and the conventional signs orientating oneself to the surface of the earth, but even the conventional shape of the universe. My aim, to fall for the centre of the earth, was much more realisable in this new frame where most of the matter was apparently on the outside. I had already decided that I rely upon the universal levitational force to lift me up, or down for observers of the Northern Hemisphere, and provide the necessary acceleration. And I assumed that the journey to the centre of the Earth, the universe, would take 42 minutes, as measured by clocks on the Earth's surface. Others have pointed out that materialistic scientists make it clear that the universal gravitational force, rather a misnomer for a structuring phenomenon, is the only force they could believe in which has no equal and opposite force. Could levity be the dynamic driving the evolution of increasingly complex self-organising systems? The difficulties were twofold. As I approached the singularity at the centre, I would be increasingly compressed in apparent size, along with the rest of the universe around me. But even more importantly, I would have to travel faster than the speed of light. This could only be achieved if I dematerialised at the start of a journey to become pure, disembodied ego. I would have to vanish and become pure information. Now I understood the deeper meaning of Carroll's parable. If I was to succeed where the scientists had failed, I would have to keep my 42 pieces of luggage and hunt the Boojum. So far I have kept good records of my cultural history and evolving identity. Nothing is perfect. I'm not generally seen as being a perfectionist, being rather slapdash in most tasks. As a child I found the idea of infinity quite ludicrous and was never upset because the God I was taught to pray to did not appear to be perfect or even answer my pathetic prayers. I found that expecting nothing meant that what I did get was always a pleasant surprise. Not being a spoilt child, I've never thought the world owed me a living. Such things as the recurrent decimal in pi and the existence of irrational numbers confirmed to me that maths was more of an art form than the vaunted key to the mysteries of the universe, and one that I had no interest in or aptitude for. My joy in coming across Gödel's theorem can be imagined, and matched my delight in finding out that hard scientists had to invent imaginary singularities to make their mathematical theories and descriptions of the universe work. Dawkins' memes, for example, remind me of Ptolemy's epicycles, except they're useless and intrusions of a hard scientist's ego into my own field of proper social science. However, I always felt that nothing was perfect, and came to understand why many mystics insisted that God could not be named, some just leaving an empty space in their writings. It has taken me considerable intellectual self-discipline, but I have eventually reached the point of being able to believe in nothing, at least in short bursts, and my greatest aim is to achieve nothing. Many years ago I wrote this as my 4-line epitaph: out of nothing I come, just to have fun. Into nothing I go at the end of the show. Creating heaven and earth as a conceptual artwork.
Have you seen behind the screen the call of dreams?
A point that should be of interest to religious intellectuals, but has so far failed to be so, is that in this geoperipheral model, the new singularity at the centre of the universe is no longer the satanic singularity known as the Big Bang, but becomes the highest point in the universe towards which all the galaxies are converging whilst accelerating. It exactly matches traditional descriptions of heaven. In ancient Greece, the evil materialistic scientists, serving the merchant class as usual, dethroned heaven by turning the flat earth into a sphere where there was no up, only out. Heaven was banished to the periphery, and hell was placed right in the centre of their model of the universe. I'm attempting in my own playful way to create heaven and earth in my own image as a conceptual artwork, and then to vanish whilst ascending into the centre of my own fundamental orifice. By avoiding death, I would avoid the hideous boredom of eternal life, or the pointless self-deception of being remembered after death. This was an authentic ego trip I was planning, stripped of all the disguises that provide such rich picking for psychiatrists. Antipodes Island and the English Channel. As my 42nd birthday, on December the 4th, 1974 approached, I had already moved to New Zealand to be near a port to get a vote to the uninhabited Antipodes Island. I had chosen this spot to converge the identity, space and time systems in my process cosmology by briefly becoming me, here, now, whilst appearing on television, especially in the Northern Hemisphere. Had already gone ahead to Plymouth to arrange for a fleet of small boats to pluck me from the sea. Its cosmology, Antipodes Island, was named by English navigators, noting its location on the opposite side of the Earth, which was a point in the English Channel near Harfleur. As a trained navigator and later navigation officer of the Royal Air Force Base in Duxford, now a museum. I am English and my family name is Channel. I took all these coincidences as a sign, but definitely not a conventional sign, not even a floating signifier. Knocking on heaven's door. Since I'll be travelling at considerable speed, with the stated aim of travelling to the centre of the universe, on my way to splash down an English Channel, I often wondered what would happen when I reached the singularity at the centre. There is no way of knowing. A few years earlier, Stanley Kubrick's famous film 2001 had portrayed a similar journey and hazarded a guess about the nature of such a singularity. I had not envisioned it that way at all, especially since I am repelled by puritanical temples of hygiene, orderly geometrical forms, and by pretty Louis XV decor. The idea that came into my mind was more like the heaven portrayed in Oriental texts, especially the one described in the classic Monkey, with beautiful goddesses and delicious peaches of immortality. I imagined their surprise as I sped through without stopping. Monkey would have approved. We are fellow spirits. I'm an excellent demon exposer, and although rarely thanked, I do what I can to protect simple persons from the consequences of their trusting naivety. Avoiding immortality. I had made preparations with my bemused followers in the unlikely eventuality that my vanishing attempt actually succeeded. I expected that even a failure would produce a great flowering of logic, love and levity to fill the vacuum left by the failure of scientific materialism, egalitarian socialism, capitalist social Darwinism and religious fundamentalism, which were driving the world to ecological and political economic collapse. In the event of my vanishing and not reappearing on the other side of the earth, these bewildered acolytes would have to assume that I must have joined Enoch, Elijah, Jesus and various Hindu and Taoist holy men in heaven. They would have to acknowledge that this event demonstrated that I was the first man to work out what on earth was really going on. I've been telling the truth all along. They must obey my final commandment. For me to vanish in every way, they must devote their lives to destroying all records that I ever existed. This would not be easy, but it would be fun to try, and they could become rich and famous doing it. My monstrous ego would finally be destroyed. French deconstructionists, priests and psychiatrists in particular, would be pleased. Marooned again. In the months preceding the deadline, an unfortunate but deeply meaningful term to me personally, both in New Zealand in general and Christchurch in particular, my announcement to the general public and media of my plans to rise in the air and vanish did not produce enough levity. The native sardonic English wit, found in great abundance in Australasia, had probably been already infected by neurotic American TV humour. Alas, their logic too was inadequate to make any rational criticisms. I was disappointed. Could this be the same city that in 1863 first published Samuel Butler's Darwin Amongst the Machines in the local newspaper? This is still, according to Gregory Bateson, the best critique of Darwin's mechanistic theory. Was this a city where Karl Popper found sanctuary and wrote his critical analysis of Marxist theory and Platonic totalitarianism? However, there was enough love in this rather odd city, founded by Anglican gentlemen in a remote swamp on the other side of the earth. I was affectionately tolerated, a refreshing change after being hated by Australian university student leaders for undermining their juvenile revolution by mistake. With not enough interest in the community to provide me with a boat, and with the superficial and humorless mass media distrustful of my motives, I was marooned in Christchurch. Since it was a delightful little city, and was years behind the ghastly times, I was satisfied with settling down, and after putting the dull-witted city council through a fun revolutionary skirmish, I began providing daily entertainments as an orator in their new cathedral square. This was an excellent stage on which to exhibit myself and to keep my wit sharp by performing my shamanistic ritual capers on the razor's edge of political correctness. I became notorious, but never a celeb, as I was far too intelligent, honest, laid back and scruffy to be trusted by the mass media makers of shallow illusions, encouraging consumerism, beaten by death and gravity. My seventh cycle ended in 1981, and I realised sadly that my nervous system might now be too old to trigger the dominant neural facility for levitation that I suspected was awaiting to be activated in the human brain. I had no other explanation for the universal human dreams of flying and the desire found in all human cultures to imagine the most perfect human beings would ascend to some sort of higher place like heaven. If caterpillars could dream, would they dream of butterflies? Is each human culture a form of chrysalis from which we can never emerge because of our fear of death? I assume that both acceptance and rejection of death and non-being has been the core value round which the symbolic threads of all previous cultures have been spun. We must cease to believe in all forms of immortality, including fame after death and having children to pass on one's genes, property and family name. We are the arrowhead of evolution. Leave the question open, so we don't lock the door and imprison mankind in a death trap. In the past, the universe as a process has undergone amazing and unpredictable transformations in form and complexity. From a burst of radiating energy to matter, then to living ecosystems of self-replicating cells, then to organisms behaving with nervous systems, then to social role systems. It's still evolving and accelerating rapidly in the direction of human symbolic expressions of meaning. Only dogmatic, dyed-in-the-wool reductionists still insist that the universe is essentially a material thing observed by godlike scientists. My experiment depended on using the mass media to produce a collective illusion, briefly converging intentionality, extensionality, and eventuality, or to put it more directly, identity, meanness, space, here-ness, and time, nowness. Nowadays, the internet would be a more practical means of achieving such a cultural symbolic convergence. I still sometimes wonder what would have happened if I'd been able to carry out my imagination experiment. It was even cleverer than those brilliantly designed but materialistic thought experiments of Kepler, Galileo and Einstein, but required more than just sitting down and thinking. To appreciate the strange parallels that I've recorded between my great adventure, the end of a scientific great work, and Lewis Carroll's poem, I thoroughly recommend The Annotated Snark, where Martin Gardner reveals the subtlety and complexity of this fine example of the penetrating power of a synthesis of logic, love and levity. Finally, a few words from Kierkegaard, the great philosopher. The Christian believer cannot be content with less than his own reality for the object of his faith, and therefore in the act of faith he leaps over the confines of what he can know. At the same time, the object of belief is itself beyond belief. Hence faith is a paradoxical relationship to the paradoxical.
Just a man.